Hello and a very warm welcome back to Summit Seashore Birding Adventures and Birds, Poetry and Literature, a series where we dip into the pages of the classics to see if we can find mention of birds. And of course also we'll have a bird poem and then a book recommendation. Now before we get on with that, let me just give you a quick update on what's been happening over the last couple of weeks. So we travelled down to Cornwall to see the long-staying, overwintering booted eagle down there, and fortunately we got there just in time for the morning showing, as it were. The bird was seen at distance through the scopes on the ground near Marazion Forest, and then it eventually moved up onto a hedge and finally took flight. And it flew behind there's a farm to the left there and across the road and then out of view. But luckily, good scope views and good binocular views as it flew across the road, showing all its details. So that was nice. And at the same time, we took the opportunity to head down to Penzance and also catch up with the Pacific Diver. So last weekend, I also caught up with a very old dear birding pal of mine, Alan Martin, and his wife Amanda. He was my bird ringing mentor and trainer back in the mid-90s, and we went on many wonderful birding expeditions and trips. Spent lots of time ringing siskins in his back garden with him. We did quite a few wagtail roosts in Surrey. We also did some ringing of nightjars on Ockham Common, and a wonderful day ringing with a dear friend of ours, now sadly passed away, Trevor Squire, out on the Isle of Sheppey, ringing avocets and redshank. Two of our real big trips were, one was out into Russia in 2000, where we got to handle some absolutely incredible birds such as hen harrier, merlin, crested tit, black redstart, blue throat, woodcock. Just a fantastic array of different species that we don't normally get to handle here in the UK. And back in '97, we also did a trip out to the Isle of May, out of the Firth of Forth in Scotland, to help out with the ringing studies there, and we spent a week in the low light lighthouse and were ringing puffin and shag and guillemot and razorbill and kittiwake. It was just an absolutely fantastic trip, and very, very memorable. So Alan and I spent our day at the Rye Harbour Nature Reserve, which I hadn't been to for quite a lot of years, and what was incredible was the new Discovery Centre, and that has been funded by partly by the Friends of Rye Harbour, and they've done so much work there. They've put in some new pools and they've made wheelchair access hides. And the Discovery Centre itself has got a wonderful cafe, and it's got books there for sale, and it's also got a classroom out the back where obviously students or school groups can go into and learn all about their local nature there in Sussex. So initially we went to pet level, and there wasn't anything rare to report, but the numbers of birds were incredible. We had at least over 200 Eurasian curlew there, and at the Rye Harbour Nature Reserve itself, there was a great variety of different birds. Of note was probably over 500 European golden plover. There was also lots of lapwing and redshank, and we had one grey plover, ring plover, dunlin, turnstone, and also we had a couple of marsh harriers. So no rarities, but just fantastic birds. And of course there in the summer You've got lots of different breeding terns and gulls and avocets and things like that. So anyway, now we're caught up with what's been happening. We're going to get into our book now, and this is, of course, H.G. Wells's War of the Worlds. Now, this was published about 1898, and so sort of the height of the British Empire and Queen Victoria on the throne. It's sort of the grandfather of all sci-fi, really, and even today it still is very readable and a really interesting book. Now, as you've probably noticed if you've been watching the series, I've been picking these books at random, and there's a reason for that, because I wanted to add some diversity and some different genres into looking at these classics and trying to find mention of birds in it. So with the War of the Worlds, it's the characters within it are quite two-dimensional. You don't really get lots of background knowledge on the characters, and there's only a few, so I'll mention them at first. There's the protagonist, or the narrator, who I consider as H.G. Wells, and we follow his journey on this trip. We also meet a few people like Ogilvy, the astronomer, and Henderson, the journalist, at the very beginning. There's mention of the narrator's wife. We also meet a character called the artilleryman. On a couple of occasions we meet a man called the curate, who is a priest, and there is also mention of his brother and his story during the War of the Worlds. Now, because it's called War of the Worlds, it's very much, and we presume this what's going on is happening globally, but it's very much focused on the county of Surrey and then up into London. So it's quite a restricted area on what's happening there. And it's especially interesting to me because it's exactly where I grew up. I grew up just outside of Woking, where it all starts off, and lots of the names mentioned are very familiar to me, such as Send. That was the village I was born in. My mother was born in that same village. Ripley, Purford, Byfleet, Old Woking, Horsell, all of them, obviously Woking, and all of these names are very familiar to me. So I'm felt very connected to this book. So for those of you who, I'm sure many of you have heard of War of the Worlds, and I'm sure many of you have also read this book. For those of you who haven't, there's going to be plenty of spoilers, so if you want to read it and haven't read it, I would switch off now, because I'm going to be putting a few spoilers out there. So the story starts off where a pod from Mars lands on Horsell Common. Now, Horsell Common is just outside of Woking, and the two I mentioned at the beginning, Ogilvy and Henderson, Ogilvy goes down to investigate this. He also has a relationship with the narrator, and he's the first to discover what's going on, and then the narrator turns up, and then we're off and running. And these pods that have landed from Mars slowly begin to open, and eventually the Martians appear, and they're seemingly affected by the gravity. But almost immediately, when approached, it is noticed that they are very aggressive, and immediately kill two of the people at the beginning, the astronomer Ogilvy and his friend Henderson. And the narrator then heads back home, back to Maybury, which is very close to where this first happens at Horsell Common. And he speaks to his wife about it and says, everything's going to be fine, we're going to be okay. But of course things weren't going to be okay. And so then we learn about how these Martians, though they're restricted by the gravity, they build these walkers, these machines, these tripods that allow them to move freely and are quite some size. Now these war machines, they emit heat rays which can burn anything in front of them. They also fire these cylinders full of this toxic black gas, and are able to manoeuvre fairly quickly. So the narrator takes his wife to a friend in Leatherhead, or family in Leatherhead, and drops her off. He borrows a horse and cart from a local pub, and he takes her there and then returns, only to find the landlord has been killed, and then we really get into the story. And it's really, during this time also, more pods have landed, but seemingly lots of people don't really know what's going on. So these pods are landing and these Martians are appearing, but some people are just going about their normal days and don't really know much about it. And so then the book progresses, and the narrator then watches these things for a bit, and then decides that he needs to move, and these tripods are seemingly moving also in the direction of London. During this little period, he goes back to his house, and the artilleryman arrives, and he's lost his unit, and they bump into each other, and a relationship sort of is built there, but then they part ways, and eventually he meets up with the curate, this priest who's a little unhinged. He's seemingly lost his faith with what's going on, and there is a big section regarding them, but all the while they're watching what these tripods, these war machines, are doing, and its complete destruction. And of course at that point we don't really know what their agenda is, other than wiping us out. But then eventually we find out that they are actually, and how they chose the different people we don't know, but they were obviously harvesting us, collecting some and putting them in baskets on their back, and seemingly collecting us for our blood or DNA, or for some reason a fuel or a food for these Martians. We end up, the book ends up going up into, there's a long story and I can't get into all of that, but eventually they get further and further towards London, and he ends up spending quite a lot of time with the curate in this particular house, and they're almost locked into this house. They daren't move because these war machines are around. And anyway, eventually the curate dies, and the narrator then breaks free of that and heads out, and he's further up into London, and he yet again bumps into the artilleryman that he had met previously. Now he has gone rogue, he has gone survival, and he's talking about how they can live under tunnels and build up this army and learn to drive these things to fight against these war machines. And the narrator eventually thinks, well, I don't really think this is going to happen, and so he continues heading on. Now, while all of this is going on, we also hear about the narrator's brother and his story, and how he escapes from London, and how he eventually gets on a ship and heads presumably to France. Finally, we get to the part where he's spent several weeks in this house, and he's finally come out. And he gets further into London, and only to discover that these giant tripods, these war machines, seem to have ceased to move. And eventually it's recorded that because of their immune system, something that they probably didn't foresee, they were affected, and this bacteria affected them, and essentially it killed the Martians within these these walking machines. So that's a rough overview of the book. Of course, it's way more in depth than that. It is a fantastic read. I really enjoyed it. It's very, very relevant. It has incredible historical relevance and lessons to be learned all within that. And I'll get into some of them when we actually look at some of the birds that I discovered within the text. Before we actually get into that, as I said, I was born in Sen, just outside of Woking. I know Horsell and all these areas really well. And for those of you who are interested, I've just put a couple of little video clips and slides together of the relevance of War of the Worlds within Woking. So here we can see this building that's covered in scaffold at the moment. Obviously it's being renovated for whatever reason, and hopefully you can see a little blue plaque up on the wall. Now this is the house where H.G. Wells actually wrote War of the Worlds when he lived on Maybury Road, and this is dead opposite Woking train station, which plays a big part within the book. Here in town, there's a little subway close to the town centre, and if you walk through that, there's a mosaic of tiles, and as you can see, this depicts the War of the Worlds and some dates on there. And so you can spend some time looking at that, and as you walk up the stairs and go left, you come across the statue of H.G. Wells. Here it's fantastically made and done. I'm not sure about the location. I think it needs to be tidied up a bit, but it's great to see a statue of this man. And then further along here we can see the giant tripod, and again this is very close to the town square, and gives you a real sense and idea of what these things were like. And I think it's how they've done this is fantastic. And actually on the ground there is, in the tiles on the ground, there is different types of bacteria, bringing to mind that they had, how the Martians had died. And finally here we've got a bit of a view of the area at Horsell Common, this sort of bold sand pit where presumably the pods from Mars first landed. So all this is in very close proximity. You can walk to the tripod and the statue and the mosaic under the subway in literally a few minutes. It's a bit of a longer walk down Maybury Road to go and see the actual house itself, and then it's literally only up the road, just a short car drive up the road. You can head out into Horsell Common to see that. Okay, so let's get into some of the birds that I found within the text now. I've written down some notes here because there is quite a few. I mean, there are references to marching hawkers and craned neck and eagle-faced man, and also there was reference to no bird song, and then further along we had a reference to flutter of bird wings. So there's little things like that, but the main ones I want to bring to mind, particularly this one. This is in chapter How I Reached Home, and this is when the narrator goes back to his house in Maybury, and he's been talking to his wife, and right at the end says, "So some respectable dodo in Mauritius might have lauded it in his nest and discussed the arrival of that shipful of pitiless sailors in want of animal food. We will peck them to death tomorrow, my dear." And of course it's a great reference to dodos, but also making out that actually there was no problem and that there was nothing to worry about, and we can deal with this later. And of course, as we know, the dodo was completely annihilated and became extinct in 1690. So that's 200 years before War of the Worlds was written. And actually more poignant was the fact that the grey auk had gone extinct only about 50 years prior to this in Iceland in 1844. So, lessons there about how, we as humans have just tramped over things and annihilated them without any thought, exactly what the Martians seem to be doing to us. Chapter 9. The fighting begins. Saturday lives in my memory as a day of suspense. It was a day of lassitude too, hot and close, with, I am told, a rapidly fluctuating barometer. I had slept but little, though my wife had succeeded in sleeping, and I rose early. I went into my garden before breakfast and stood listening, but towards the common there was nothing stirring but a lark. And of course that could possibly be a skylark or even woodlark. In this part, he had come out of the house he was hiding in, where it was covered in rubble. The neighbouring houses had all been wrecked, but none had been burned. Their walls stood sometimes to the second story, with smashed windows and shattered doors. The red weed grew tumultuously in their roofless rooms. Below me was a great pit, with crows struggling for its refuse. A number of other birds hopped about among the ruins. Still further along, he's met up with the artilleryman who, like I said, went a little rogue, and they're talking and now recognise each other. And the paragraph goes, "Good luck," he said. "We are the lucky ones. Fancy you." He put out a hand and I took it. "I crawled up a drain," he said, "but they didn't kill everyone. And after they went away, I got off towards Walton across the fields. But it's not 16 days altogether, and your hair is grey." He looked over his shoulder suddenly. "Only a rook," he said. "One gets to know the birds have shadows these days." So, nice little reference there to rook. And still further along, "I'm not an ornamental soldier, and at the best and worst death, it's just death. And it's the man that keeps on thinking come through. I saw everyone tracking away south," says I. "Food won't last this way," and I turned right back. I went for the Martians like a sparrow goes for man. Obviously thinking, referencing to house sparrows that sort of hang around men for and in villages and towns for scraps. And finally, there's a part here where this is when he is in London. He's noticed that the tripods aren't moving anymore, and there seems to be something different going on. An insane resolve possessed me. I would die and end it, and I would save myself even the trouble of killing myself. I marched on recklessly towards this Titan, and then as I drew nearer and the light grew, I saw that a multitude of black birds were circling and clustering about the hood. And then a little bit further along in that same chapter, the thought that had flashed into my mind grew real, grew credible. I felt no fear, only a wild trembling exultation as I ran up the hill towards the motionless monster. Out of the hood hung lank shreds of brown, at which the hungry birds pecked and tore. The Martians were dead. One of the things I learnt while I was doing my research for this as well is that H.G. Wells was actually friends and went to college with Thomas Henry Huxley, who was also known as Darwin's bulldog and was an advocate for his theory of evolution and natural selection. And that theme, if you think about it, actually does run through this book. The Martians just completely and utterly wiping out the human race, and with no sort of worry or care of what they were doing. And of course, that's something that we've done as humans throughout generations, is to just disregard, habitats and breeding colonies and numbers of birds or fish or insects, only worrying about how we benefit from advancing in our quest to sort of conquer the world. So it's a great thing to think about in some of these books. So that's it for the War of the Worlds. Nice to find a few references in there. And as always, I wanted to bring you a poem. This particular one I wrote. So I don't know how good it is, but it's called The Woking Peregrine. And of course, I've written this after reading War of the Worlds, so I hope it makes sense. Not that it compares to that remote cragged eyrie and Lundy's Rain, where guano-sprayed cliffs echo memory, ancestral fame, but it'll do. From my urban BAT vantage, Dove's Quarry abound, seascape exchange for one-way system, construction sound, and the square's fallen cenotaph, crowd gathered around. A lesson in focus through magnifying glass and Linnaeus's hierarchy, genus and class. And a child reacts to my apex shape. I see it, while stretching and zipping the barbs of my nape. And below they squint skyward for the wanderer to soar. Scope-top tripods, aid memoir of the Horsell Sands War. Sundown, high-mounted I search for my prey, goat-suckers arrival who shun the bright day. Dust-cloaked and shadowed, biding my time to stoop unobserved, rake havoc to spine. Tonight waves white hanky unanswered once more, St Albans Duke Prince has settled a score. Protection and cryptic, but betrayed by the light, the unending electric provided clear sight. Wing claps and churring fall silent, no wreath, crepuscular moth hunters who caw to the heath, and slain fern owl en route to a ravenous nest, while mud snipes time roding continues no rest. And Mars we've forgotten for what he'd once done. Phase 2 is now inbound, shot hot from his gun. Finally, my bird book recommendation is this: A History of Ornithology by Peter Birchman. Now, this book I didn't know about when I first started doing The Wisdom of Birds, and actually it was a book that Alan Martin recommended to me, and I quickly got home and ordered one, and I'm only slightly into it, but it's absolutely fantastic. It's just packed full of incredible information, and I'm really loving this. So if you want to have something to read that takes us all through our journey here in the UK with ornithology, this is the book. So next time in Birds, Poetry and Literature, we will be reading and looking through a fantastic classic, and this is Herman Melville's Moby Dick. Okay, until next time, happy birding.